Shalom from Jerusalem. This is TV7's Israel at War update, and today is the 70th day since the Islamist terror groups from the Hamas-plagued Gaza Strip launched an onslaught on southern Israel, declaring war by perpetrating a massacre, murdering some 1,400 mostly civilians, wounding over 4,800 others, and kidnapping some 245 individuals, including women, men, elderly, children, and infants. As we continue to update you from here in Jerusalem, let's now turn to our TV7 editor-at-large, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, what can you tell us about the latest?
So let's go from north to south and then back to the central and main arena. In the north, quite a heavy shelling, rocketing rather, from Hezbollah in Lebanon towards Kiryat Shmona and other Israeli towns and villages south of the border. Up to now, no reports of casualties. And of course, the Israeli Defense Forces struck back. There is some uptick in the escalation there, but not so much as to threaten a general war. In the far south, the Houthis are again harassing shipping around the Bab el-Mandeb Straits area. This time around, attacks on two ships. And obviously, as the administration spokespeople have said, this is an international problem, and a task force is being organized. Stay tuned. There will be more later. Obviously, both more patrolling and perhaps even a retaliatory or preemptive strike in Yemen. But the main event is still Gaza, both in the north central area around Gaza City and its suburbs, such as Sajaiya. And in Khan Yunis, the stronghold of Yahya Sinwar and his colleagues at the Hamas leadership, the Israeli commando units have been operating on the ruins of Sinwar's old house, which was flattened earlier in the campaign. The main diplomatic or defense and diplomacy event here has been the visit of National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who met with most of the key Israeli players, Prime Minister Netanyahu, Minister Gantz, the entire war cabinet, Mossad chief Dadi Barnea, for a talk regarding the possible restart of hostage negotiations. And the messages which Sullivan has given both privately and publicly apparently come from the manual of the US Armed Forces, where they divide the various phases in military operations into 6 phases. We won't go into all of them, but according to the American book, the IDF in Gaza is now in phase 3, which is called dominance. The IDF is using its most intensive power in order to gain control and dominance over all parts of Gaza. And what the administration wants Israel to do is to move into phase 4, which is called stability or stabilization. And then once the war is declared over, much like President Bush has declared mission accomplished when he came to the USS Abraham Lincoln a few weeks after the war in Iraq started 20 years ago, but the mission was accomplished, the war was not over. The Biden administration wants Israel to change its tactics and from now on go into focused, targeted operations against Sinwar and the rest, so that the world and the American public opinion will not see the sites of Israeli fighters bombing Gaza, Israeli tanks rolling down streets, and this will perhaps quiet some of the criticism there. One more comment regarding the northern border. National Security Advisor Sullivan mentioned that once this tension is over, Israeli residents should feel secure and safe enough to go back and live south of the border, which means that through deterrence and diplomacy, the US administration hopes to solve the Hezbollah presence in South Lebanon. But there is the hint there that if the deterrence and diplomacy do not do their magic, military operations will be tolerated.
Indeed. Well, with regard to the latter, let's start with that. I think one of the quite interesting points that were made was the fact that indeed they're trying to push it via diplomatic means and with deterrence. Nevertheless, if it doesn't work with Iran, which is the patron of Hezbollah, why would it work with one of its tentacles that is less or less important from an Iranian perspective than when it conducts its operations proper? Another point that I think is important to highlight is the fact that French President Emmanuel Macron canceled his trip to Lebanon, which was scheduled for next week. And the reason for that was because they didn't manage to attain a certain diplomatic breakthrough vis-a-vis Hezbollah in an attempt to de-escalate the situation. Unfortunately, this does not bid too well for the days ahead. Nevertheless, there is ongoing efforts behind the scenes, diplomatic efforts to push for a type of resolution that would avoid a new front to this war, something that Israel is very keen to achieve. I think also another point that is important to highlight is that in the discussions between the Mossad director, David Barnea, with Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, they discussed elaborately also the Iranian question, since it is a very tough question to deal with, considering the fact that the Biden administration is currently very tentative to the political scene back home in light of the presidential election scheduled for next year, and therefore it is something that Israel also takes into the equation. Nevertheless, I don't think the Iranians plan to give the Biden administration or the United States at large a break until after the elections, and it will continue to act according to its own interests. Now, let's also turn now to the commander of the Israeli Air Force Task Force for Air and Missile Defense, Brigadier General in Reserve Doron Gavish. Thank you for joining us, General. I'd like to ask you, just before we started today's recording, we had some alarms going off with projectiles being launched from the Hamas-plagued Gaza Strip towards a number of cities, including to the city of Jerusalem. This is not obviously the first incident today, nor in the last 24 hours. Therefore, if you can give us a little bit of an indication, where are we at this stage, considering the fact that it seems that they're still trying to exact surprises from Israel, particularly via its projectiles being launched towards densely populated areas, irrespective of Israeli capacity to intercept pretty much most of them?
Well, indeed, Jonathan, the sirens were heard in the last few minutes, so we don't have yet any indications of interceptions, which means basically that they went to open areas, but we will know it probably in the next few minutes. But in overall, we could say that we do see still some rockets that are being launched from the Gaza Strip, but once again, we have to look on the weekly, I would say, average, and the number of rockets that are being shot in the last few days, thought Israel is lowing. With the time, we didn't have sirens in the last almost 72 hours in the in the most of the cities and central of Israel. It's not a surprise. The reason that it is happening is because as we know, the IDF is pressing very hard on the Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and the Israeli Air Force is attacking them very strongly. The strikes are still there against Hamas targets, and of course, the close support, as we know, to the ground forces. So all of this together, the press of the operation in the ground from the air this is what brings to the situation that the number of rockets overall are being lowered. But one word that I would like to take from what you were just mentioning, you were saying surprise. Well, for us, it is not surprise. The IDF is fully deployed also in the Jerusalem area, and not only from the Gaza Strip, by the way, also from different other directions. And probably we are deployed today in the vastest deployment that we ever had for air and missile defense and for multi-directions. And as we saw, even the missiles that came from the Red Sea couldn't surprise us. So we need to be humble of it because the surprise could happen, but in general, we could say that our enemies didn't surprise us yet because the Israeli Air Force is really fully deployed and ready for those. But few other things that I would like to mention with regard to the Gaza Strip, Jonathan, is that we always see that we always say that we see the IDF enlarging its ground operation, and it was just announced a few hours ago that the IDF occupied in the Sajaiya, one of the largest neighborhoods around the Gaza Strip, occupied the main command post of the Hamas. So we see the IDF in a very methodological way continuing the fight. You mentioned, or Amir was mentioning that there were some Hamas terrorists that were found next to the house of the leader of the Hamas. Those are all the signs of the enlargement of this operation. And we really hope that in the next few days, 1 week or two, we could say that we are in fully control of the northern part of the Gaza Strip. But also when we are saying this, it doesn't mean that here and there, the Hamas terrorists won't be able to shoot a missile, a rocket, or one or two, but we don't see any big numbers as we saw in the past. The last thing which I would like to say with regard to the Gaza Strip is that yesterday the IDF rescued three bodies, relatively rescued, three bodies, two of them of Israeli soldiers that were kidnapped, and one young guy that was kidnapped from the party in Reim. What is important to say that those two soldiers that were kidnapped, we know that they were kidnapped alive to the Gaza Strip. So we saw it more than once, that very unfortunate. The Hamas killed more than one or two of our hostages. Of course, they would say that those are the Israeli bombarders, but unfortunately, we saw more than once that this is what happened to those that were kidnapped. And of course, this is very sad, but then from the other end, it shows that Israel, the IDF, is still very committed to bring back the hostages, life or dead. But this is one of the main goals of this war.
Indeed. Elia Toledano, 28 years in his passing during, as you mentioned, the Nova Festival adjacent to, in the vicinity of Reim, which is adjacent to the border, was kidnapped from there, and with him so many more. But let's now turn also to retired Brigadier General Relik Shafir, a former Israeli Air Force commander and fighter pilot. Thank you for joining us, General. I'd like to ask you particularly on the northern arena, particularly Hezbollah in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq. It seems like there is much motion taking place there right now by various Iranian proxies and preparatory work. Obviously, at this stage, it doesn't seem that the Iranians are too eager to enter into the war, but nonetheless, miscalculation is seemingly in a more likely every day that passes.
Yes, let's let's think about the possibility that the Hezbollah will take on or stop its daily routine of rockets and anti-tank missiles, etc. What will bring them into this? Either a ceasefire. They've shown in the past that when there was a ceasefire with Gaza, they didn't fire anything. Um, or a direct threat to Lebanon. I don't see anytime soon a ceasefire, maybe except for exchanging hostages for prisoners, taking place in Gaza, and therefore the daily harassment of Hezbollah will continue. As the other players, the French and the US, are stationary at this time. Uh, about 100,000 Lebanese have evacuated the southern Lebanon to the north, and this puts some pressure on Lebanon, though so far we haven't seen any leverage by those who made it up north on the government or Hezbollah. So my guess is that the Israeli Defense Forces will have to push Hezbollah north by force. This is something that the Air Force can do on its own because of not only the dominance, but the fact that there are no inhabitants in the area between the Israeli border and the Litani. The pressure on Israel to do this is because there are 100,000 Israelis who left their homes along the border lines and the towns around the border and are pressing. They want to go back home. They won't do it unless Hezbollah is pushed back. This is a change that Hezbollah will have to undertake, and it will look like it was either threatened or defeated, none of which looks realistic at this time. So I think it will take more active, stronger attacks by the Air Force, and these we'll see in the days to come.
I think it's important to highlight the difference between the Lebanese side and the Israeli side, since we know that the Lebanese state is pretty much a failed state. Its economy is in shambles, and nonetheless, as you mentioned, the 60,000 residents of southern Lebanon who moved up, or between 60 to 100,000 are the estimates. They rely very heavily on the construct of Lebanon, the social construct, where there are warlords in every region taking care of their own religious sectors. For instance, if now Christian villages go north, either they're with the Aouns or another organization, but the various families who control the various sectors, they usually also take care of those people who are displaced and make sure that they have places. And therefore, there's not as much pressure on Hezbollah as there would have been in another scenario. Now, in Israel, on the other hand, many of those families rely either on their own pockets, in most cases, as well as on the state, which is supposed to take care of them. So there is an increased budgetary consideration within this context. Now, Mr. Oren, when we're looking at Gaza, obviously going into a ceasefire now would mean capitulating to the same terrorists who committed the massacre of October 7th. Nevertheless, when we're looking at northern Israel, the considerations are somewhat different, of course, with the constraints that were imposed on Israel by the United States, but also considerations that go beyond that. Could you elaborate on that point?
Well, taking the scenario which General Shafir just outlined, one wonders what's the end state of that military operation, assuming that indeed the provocations by Hezbollah are unbearable and that the IDF goes on to strike Hezbollah both from the air and through a ground maneuver, and pushes all of the Hezbollah forces, including its commander, Radwan, which probably has some 10,000 fighters, north of the Litani River. What then? Does the Israeli force stay there to occupy this zone, much like it did in 1978 when two enclaves were established under local, at least nominally, local authority by two renegade majors from the Lebanese army, or after 1982, or to be more precise, 1985, after the withdrawal from the Awali River towards this area, where the security zone with the so-called South Lebanese army was established. What then? When does the IDF go home, and what would prevent Hezbollah from launching rockets from north of the Litani River? So eventually there will have to be some sort of an arrangement. Now Hezbollah demands some rectifications in the blue line. This is not the international line, this is the line of withdrawal. After Israel withdrew in the year 2000, the UN has agreed that the withdrawal was complete and that this is tantamount to an international line. What Hezbollah demands, for instance, is the return of the so-called Sheba farms to Lebanon. But Syria claims that Sheba farms are its own. And Syria and Israel obviously have no peace agreement. So unless Syria announces that it is relinquishing the Sheba farms to Lebanon, which claims them as its own sovereign country, one doesn't see how this impasse is being broken.
Well, the only narrative that the Hezbollah terror organization is still holding in order to claim that it is fighting Israeli occupation, so to speak, of Lebanon, has to do with the Sheba farms. Nevertheless, any Lebanese knows that Sheba farms was never Lebanese and it was always Syrian. And therefore, this is also a point of contention within Lebanon among the communities there, which are not very favorable towards Hezbollah.
Well, you know that Lebanon itself was part of Syria, Greater Syria, and the Syrians for many years refused to recognize Lebanon as a sovereign country, refused to delineate the border between the countries, and only around 2005, after the Rafik Hariri assassination, withdrew their forces from Lebanon.
Indeed. Well, Lebanon was also before that only a Christian nation, and today it's thorn for everyone, not only in this region but beyond. But let's turn to General Gavish. We have roughly 3 minutes left. I apologize, and therefore both you, General Gavish, and General Shafir will have to share that time. In 1.5 minutes, if you can give me a little bit of an understanding on the not so immediate threats to Israel, but farther away, Iraq, Yemen, they're still posing a threat both to Israel's strategic interests, but also to Israel proper.
Well, indeed, Jonathan, I just will update that from the last barrage of rockets that were shot toward Jerusalem, some of them were intercepted, the other fell in open areas and without any injuries or wounded in the Israeli side. And so once again, they were trying, and the way that Israel is fighting against it, mainly with the Iron Dome, but also with the David Sling system, is doing his job. and the people that went to the shelters together, no people that were armed, very important. Going back to your question, and you call it again and again the elephant in the room. The real strategic threat to Israel is Iran. We see all the proxies that we are fighting against in the last war, or partially fighting with, which is Lebanon and the Houthis, and we see what is happening in Iraq, which is mainly against the US forces. But I think we should highlight, and we can't forget that the main challenge, the strategic challenge to Israel is really Iran. And I really hope that coming out of this war, there would be a worldwide understanding that Iran, this is something that needs to be taken care of. The way that the Iranians are working is not only a strategic threat toward Israel, it is strategic threat toward the Western world. We see what is happening with the shipments in Bab el-Mandab through their proxy, the Houthis in Yemen. But this is not the only place where the Iranians are. And I think this is the main challenge that hopefully the Western world will deal with coming out of this war.
Thank you, General Gavish. General Shafir, you have roughly 1 minute and 10 seconds.
I think the main challenge that we have is retaining a coalition of the West to ward off the threat of Iran. We're looking back at Prime Minister Rabin about 30 years ago, who looked at Iran and said, we need to create some kind of a coalition or relax the very close area with the Palestinians, which is the pre-thoughts of the Oslo Accords. And will Israel be clever enough to take the Palestinian question with the Western world, United States leading it, and create some kind of a sustainable balance rather than an acceleration of the conflict?
Well, this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank General Shafir, General Gavish, and Mr. Oren for taking out of your times to update us on the latest. And I'd like to thank all of you at home as well. And until our next update, from here in Jerusalem, wishing you Shabbat Shalom.
My name is Doron Gavish, and my background, 30 years of serving in the Israeli Air Force. My last job, I was the commander of the Israeli Air and Missile Defense during the introduction of the Iron Dome to the defense of Israel. All of this allows me really to be part of the team here in TV7. It is super important to have such a platform. We talk about the global situation, we talk about Israel and those different angles which are relevant to the discussion.